Bowers welcoming you to Dialogue at EPlusTV 6 and a conversation with Dr. Hal Poe. And I want to get this correct. He is the Chuck Colson Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University. He's also the author of a most recent work. It's on Kindle. It will soon be out in hardback, paperback? Paperback coming up. It's called Total Commitment. That's the first part. It's a memoir of God and politics. That's the second part. And the third part is when a Republican was elected governor of South Carolina. And so that's a title as we used to see titles on books. Yeah,
the short title is Total Commitment.
Okay, there you go. Because they want 3 words or less now, right? You know, it's fun reading old titles of old books because they went on forever. It's good to see you.
It's good to be back.
All right, so this goes back. Let's set the stage. This goes back to the early 1970s.
1974.
We're in South Carolina, obviously. Okay, but prior to that, in '72, because I want to get that history. Tell us what you were doing, because we associate you as a college professor.
All right.
And so your life was different in those days.
My life was different. My career plan was to be a lawyer and a politician.
Okay. So you're what age in the early 70s?
I was born in 1950.
Okay. All right.
So I was just out of college.
Okay. Early 20s. You're about the same age. I was born in 49.
In 1966, I did something terribly upsetting to my family. Right. I didn't become an axe murderer.
Okay.
I wasn't a heroin pusher.
Okay.
I became a Republican. And there were no Republicans in the South in 1966, except scallywags.
Are very liberal.
They were, and they tended to be from Philadelphia or Milwaukee.
We had a few Republicans in Alabama in those, and you were beginning to get the move because of Goldwater.
Yes.
But they tended to be more liberal than George Wallace, obviously, especially on racial issues. They were kind of the moderate country club business leader thing, and some of them were imports. Yankees that had come down with factories and stuff.
And they had absolutely nothing to do with the political system of the South, which was thoroughly Democrat from the time of Thomas Jefferson. And Republicans were those people who fought on the other side in the Civil War. That was the way it was all understood.
Absolutely, yeah. And so you had to be African-American almost to be Republican in the South.
Or from the mountains.
Yeah, okay,
So the mountains never seceded.
East Tennessee.
East Tennessee, Western North Carolina was Republican territory.
So why did you make this dramatic change?
And there were a number of us, young people, we were in high school, were concerned with a political system that had grown lazy. And we thought a 2-party system would put a little juice into the government and clean up things.
This is after the Goldwater defeat in '64. Right, okay, so you're part of that next wave that's coming up.
Yes.
Right, okay, all right.
Because in '64, I was just, I was 13 years old in the 1964
Why,
election.
as a sophomore in high school, are you getting into politics then, that seriously?
Well, I don't know. One thing, you may notice this eye is a little bit closed.
All right.
I have amblyopia, lazy eye. So for all practical purposes, I only have one good eye that I can use. That affects how you throw a ball, hit a ball, kick a ball, pitch a ball. Anything you can do with sports related to a ball, and that's all the sports in the United States, I couldn't do.
Any of those,
Yeah, I had no idea where the object was in the air. And so I just found another sport. And in South Carolina, politics is the sport.
By 1972, in the election campaign of Richard Nixon, you have worked your way up to what?
In '72, I was the chairman of the South Carolina College Republicans. And I was asked to join the committee to re-elect the president as in charge of the youth campaign in South Carolina.
Okay. Pretty heady stuff.
It was heady stuff. So I was in the room with all of the big players in South Carolina Republican politics.
Which, South Carolina
which
at that
meant no office holders. But just party hacks.
So Strom Thurmond and those guys were what in those days?
Strom Thurmond left the Democratic Party in 1964. He broke with Lyndon Johnson.
Civil rights.
And so civil rights was a big part of it. He saw the 1965 civil rights legislation coming. And so race was an issue. But it never caught hold in the South People didn't switch to the Republican Party in 1964 or 66 or 68 or 70. The state legislature was solidly Democrat.
See,
the governors were Democrats. You'd have a few odd situations. In Tennessee,
was different.
You had that large Republican bloc in East Tennessee.
That produced the Howard Baker and Lamar Alexanders and all those guys.
And so you didn't really get a big swing to the Republican Party until abortion became an issue. And that was the 1980 presidential campaign.
So in that situation, you're ahead of the young Republican. When you hear about Watergate,
Watergate happened in June of '72.
But this is a committee to re-elect.
And I felt in my bones that somehow or other, the committee to re-elect the president was involved in it. I was particularly concerned about an individual who'd made a reputation for himself for dirty tricks. That fellow was Chuck Colson.
Whom you knew.
Not then. Today I'm the Chuck Colson Professor of Faith and Culture. And Chuck and I had many a laugh over this because he wound up in prison as a prisoner. I wound up in prison as a prison chaplain. But I left the committee to re-elect the president in July. I resigned.
To be succeeded by?
Lee Atwater. And that was Lee Atwater's beginning in politics. That was his first big chance.
So if you hadn't left, we wouldn't know him.
You would not know him. No.
And you'd probably been in prison.
I would have been in prison, no doubt about it.
All right, you talked about the thing that concerns you, and before we get the name of the book is Total Commitment, and the book comes, if you'll pick that pen up and show, this was a campaign pen.
All right, now,
for 1972.
This was 1972, and it's a blue pen with the simple words, Total Commitment. This pen was only given to members of the committee to re-elect the president. And one of Nixon's White House staffers, Harry Dent, who had been chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party, before that he was Strom Thurmond's administrative assistant in the United States Senate. So he was a key player in Southern politics. Harry came and gave the pep talk to the newly formed South Carolina Committee to re-elect the president. And he told us, Richard Nixon's re-election is more important to us than our jobs, than our families, than our churches. And I thought, I've heard this speech before, only it was at a revival meeting, and he was talking about Jesus. And so that's when I first began to think, I'm making a bargain with the devil, because when I was 10 years old, I had a call to preach. I knew I'd been called to preach. And I'd been running away from that call since I was 10 years old.
The book is called Total Commitment. Now you know why. Dr. Hal Poe is our guest, and we'll continue this conversation. This is Dialogue at EPlusTV 6. Welcome back to Dialogue at EPlusTV 6 and a conversation with Dr. Hal Poe. He is the Chuck Colson Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University. His most recent book is on Kindle and will be coming out soon in print version. It's called Total Commitment, a memoir of God and politics, and it also is based on when the Republicans elected a governor in South Carolina, which was 1974.
1974.
So you stayed in politics, obviously, even though you got off the committee to re-elect the president.
Well, I thought I had left. I withdrew. But I still had my friends. And in 1974, a friend of mine asked me to help him elect the party chairman, which meant going to the precinct meeting, then going to the county convention, then going to the state convention to vote for my friend's friend for party chairman. That man was elected. At the time, I'd been out of politics for a year and a half. And I was at the airport one day. I was working for a law firm. I was delivering some papers to the airport authority in Greenville, South Carolina. I was at one end of the mezzanine, And at the other end of the mezzanine, I saw the new state party chairman. He was carrying two great big leather suitcases. He dropped them and yelled my name, "Hal, old buddy!" And with arms outstretched, he was an old football player.
Okay.
And he started coming at me, and I'm thinking, he's going to tackle me. He embraced me like a long-lost brother, pumped me up and said, "Hal, old buddy, old pal."
Okay.
And he asked me to be the finance director of the South Carolina Republican Party. I was 23 years old.
Okay. Wow.
And so I was going to be the chief fundraising officer
Wow.
for the party, the #2 man in the party. And he did the worst thing possible. He waved dollar bills in front of my face. And I quickly succumbed, and against my better judgment. So I went to, moved down to Columbia and took up the job.
Took up the job, so you took this full-time job.
Full-time job. Okay. It tripled my salary.
Okay.
And so I was back in politics.
All right. So what's the situation in Carolina?
All right. Governor's race in 1974, we had not, as Republicans, elected a governor since Reconstruction.
Okay.
100 years. And the party leaders got the idea that they would recruit General William Westmoreland, who led the Vietnamese War. He was a native of South Carolina. Okay. And they recruited him to run as governor, for governor, as the Republican nominee.
Who's the Democrat?
The Democrat was even more fascinating. Normally in South Carolina, the lieutenant governor is promoted.
Okay.
And so the lieutenant governor was running. But Congressman William Jennings Bryan Dorn, who for many years had been chair of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, had decided to retire to South Carolina as governor, and his wife could be the first lady, and they would live in the governor's mansion, which is a grand, grand affair. And so here was a hot race. And the Democratic Party was divided, deeply divided, because both of them had so many people indebted to them. Now, in South Carolina, there's always a joke candidate. And this year, there were 3 joke candidates. Ben Deacle, who was the afternoon talk show host on the KC West Columbia Countrypolitan Radio, was running. Mr. Dukes owned 4 or 5 barbecue restaurants in small towns in lower South Carolina, towns of less than 3,000. And then the funniest one of all, there was a fellow from Charleston who'd gone to Harvard and then got a job in New York as a mortgage banker. He moved back to South Carolina just a few months earlier and announced he was going to run for governor. And that was the joke. His name was Pug Ravenel.
Now, obviously, General Westmoreland didn't get the nomination. Who got the Republican nomination?
Well, the party workers, the people who do the feet on the ground, the ones who at the precinct level were trying to create a Republican Party, they did not like the idea of a candidate who had never voted. And Westmoreland had never voted, never participated in politics, did not have a party. He didn't know if he was a Republican or a Democrat. He had no conviction about that. So they asked a dentist from Charleston to run, Jim Edwards.
Our first Republican governor was the dentist from Memphis.
How about that? The dentists have the inside track on this.
That's amazing.
And the other thing that was decided at the state convention was, instead of nominating the candidate by the convention method, which had been the rule for decades and decades and decades, and that way the party establishment controls who's going to be nominated, the precinct workers wanted a primary. So we had our first primary in South Carolina history. And in the primary, the dentist won, even though Westmoreland was odds-on favorite in the public opinion polls to win if he were the candidate. South Carolina would have elected him governor, but of 950,000 registered voters, only 35,000 voted in the Republican primary.
Wow. Wow.
So it was only the hardcore.
So it was only the hardcore.
And that's how large the Republican Party was then, 35,000 out of 950,000.
The Republican nominee then is not Westmoreland.
No,
but the
it's
Republican,
Jim Edwards.
And Jim Edwards then goes on to win.
He went on to win. The morning of the election, he had a recognition factor of 20%. That is, only 20% of the voters had ever heard his name.
How did he win?
That evening, he won an overwhelming majority.
How?
Because the same thing that's going on in national politics this year, the voters are so upset with the leadership of the country, the leadership of the parties. They're going to teach them all a lesson.
So,
And I think that's going on with Bernie Sanders' campaign. I think it's going on with Donald Trump's campaign.
The people rise up and speak.
And
And
so-
obviously it had moved beyond. I mean, he had to have gotten a Democrat vote, right?
Here's what he was elected by the Democrats.
Yeah.
Yes, there weren't there weren't enough Republicans to elect anybody. No, what happened was Pug Ravenel wound up being not the joke candidate, but the winner of the Democratic primary.
Okay. So the
young vote kicked in. This was 74.
Okay.
The baby boom generation was finally voting.
Okay.
And Pug was a new face, a fresh face, and he was a media face.
Okay.
He didn't have an organization, but he put on the slickest TV campaign that had ever been seen in the South. And he was intense and sincere.
Okay.
And he looked at the camera, and he had an open shirt and collar, and the young people loved him.
Okay.
And it was a runaway. Congressman William Jennings Bryan Dorn looked like somebody who had the name William Jennings Bryan Dorn. And so...
so this was enough people on both sides.
And it was dangerous for the Democratic establishment, for this outsider to come in. And they had to get rid of him.
Okay.
And the way they got rid of him was a court case declaring him ineligible to serve as governor because he did not meet the residency requirements. He wasn't really one of us.
So who wound up on the ballot then? Did he make it to the ballot?
Let me finish the story. So he went to the court, and the judge who heard the case ruled him ineligible. In South Carolina, judges are elected by the state legislature. The Supreme Court is elected by the state legislature. And by an odd coincidence, the judge who heard the case, who had the unfortunate name of Bubba Ness, was elevated to the Supreme Court a few months later. Just pure coincidence. Well, it outraged the voters. Instead of having another primary, the executive committee of the Democratic Party called a special convention where Congressman William Jennings Bryan Dorn was given the nomination.
Wow. And so Edwards then becomes the counter for everybody.
Edwards was the nominee of the Republicans. Congressman William Jennings Bryan Dorn was the nominee for the Democrats. And the day of the election, Edwards won. So it was the outrage of the public.
The implication of all of this and the reason for putting this in a book, we'll find out next as we continue this conversation with Dr. Hal Poe on Dialogue here at EPlusTV 6. Welcome back to Dialogue at EPlusTV 6 and a conversation with Dr. Hal Poe about his most recent work. It's called Total Commitment, a memoir of God and politics and when Republicans elected a governor in South Carolina in 1974. What was the implication of this? Why did you decide to focus on this now in this work?
Well, I wrote a memoir 25 years ago. Actually, a little more than that. The year my first daughter was born, I decided to write up this story. Because it was the big shift in my life.
What happened to you as a result?
Well, as a result of in the midst of the campaign, I surrendered to preach. I knew God had called me. And I came to the conviction that the issues in the United States that concerned me the most were spiritual issues that had no political solution. You cannot solve spiritual problems politically.
Did that come from a sense of what you had seen in that campaign?
Well, it was the accumulation, because ever since I was 10 years old, we're now in the area of the supernatural. Since I was 10 years old, God had been speaking to me through other people in a variety of events, consistently and regularly, from the time of 10 till the time I was 23. One golden October afternoon in the middle of the campaign, Nixon resigned in August.
All right, that's right.
Republicans lost almost every election in the country. Gerald Ford was now the president.
I was here. Ray Blanton comes in and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Jim Sasser. Yeah, big year.
And I was going to Anderson, South Carolina to make arrangements for President Ford to come down for a rally fundraising event. Along the way, driving through the countryside, it was as though God were saying, all right, if you're not going to preach, I'm not going to bring this up ever again. Okay. And that was more frightening to me than preaching. Okay. So instead of going to Anderson, I went to see my pastor and tell him that God had called me to preach. Okay. And I thought he was going to be shocked because he knew how deeply involved I was in politics. And he said, well, I wondered when you were finally going to do this. Okay. Then I had to break it to my parents, who, you know, were expecting their son to be president of the United States. And I went home and sat them down and told them the sad news. And they said, well, we wondered when you were finally going to do this. Okay. And so the only person really surprised by it was me. All right. And so it's important now, I think, because over the last 30 years, churches and denominations have neglected calling out young people into the ministry. There was a time when young people heard the call of God through summer camps, through youth revivals, through a number of different ways that regularly in the life of a church over the course of a year, young people would be asked, is God calling you into full-time Christian service?
You know, Monsignor Kirk was a guest of ours one time, and it was in high school. Influence, none. Ask him. Is this not, you know, I mean, it was, and I thought, yeah, you know, and it was like, the thought had obviously been there. Yeah. It was like, then it comes, yeah.
And it needs to be in the discussion. Okay. Because the call often comes through other people.
Is that part of the point of this book?
It's part of the point of the book, yeah. Okay. Because here's the thing. I was leaving politics to enter the ministry, and within 6 years, so much of the evangelical church was leaving the ministry to enter politics. Okay. And the drive of conservative Christians from 1980 with the election of Richard Nixon, of Ronald Reagan, up until the death of Antonin Scalia, has been focused on, well, if we can just get control of the presidency, we can control the Supreme Court, and then all our problems will be solved, because the political system is what solves spiritual issues rather than God.
Okay. And you see that fundamentalism.
And I think Bible-believing Christianity has been running in the wrong direction since 1980.
Given up the power. Has given up the power.
Yeah, it's a supernatural issue.
Yeah, it is.
You cannot solve spiritual problems with political means.
In that light, and we've got a limited amount of time, you had spiritual discussions with both Lee Atwater and Chuck Colson coming out of those experiences. Mm-hmm. You know, what was that like?
Well, it was fascinating. Lee took over my job as on the committee to re-elect the president. He went on to be involved in a number of campaigns and wound up as a deputy in the White House, Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign. And I was a pastor at the time, hadn't been in touch with any of my old political cronies in years. I was preparing a sermon on jealousy, and the most awful thing happened. I realized I was jealous of Atwater. It was just humiliating. And so what do? The only thing I can do is sit down and write a letter to Atwater, of all people, who I never liked, and tell him I was jealous of him. And this is the irrationality of sin, because I didn't want to do what he was doing. I loved what I was doing. I have loved the ministry, every aspect of it.
But he was in the White House.
But he was in the White House. And you know, there's that glow.
Right. Yeah.
So I wrote him the letter, and to my surprise, he wrote back a long handwritten letter, which is to say he did not want his secretary to see it.
Okay.
A long handwritten letter pouring out his soul about the spiritual issues in his life. And we carried on a correspondence from then over the next 6 years until he died. And people have often commented he had a sudden conversion experience shortly before his death. It was one of the most long, drawn-out conversions I've ever been
that side
involved
compared
in.
to the media analysis.
Yeah.
'Cause from the media side, it would be like, well, what happened to Lee Atwater? Well, he gets cancer, and suddenly he finds God.
Yeah, but it wasn't sudden.
That way.
It'd been
All right, what about Chuck Colson?
Chuck Colson, I wrote a book in 1996, The Gospel and Its Meaning. I was invited to give some seminars for the C.S. Lewis Summer Institute in Oxford and Cambridge in 1998 on this subject. Chuck Colson was there and sat in on my seminars, and we struck up an acquaintance. A couple of years later, Chuck allowed us at Union to name a professorship for him. So I am the Charles Colson Professor of Faith and Culture, and Chuck and Prison Fellowship funded that chair. And we had many conversations over the years about those early years, and many laughs.
Total Commitment is the name of the book, and you go from that in this life. That very clearly, if you're on the committee to re-elect the president in 1972, nothing else mattered.
Nothing else mattered.
And so for Colson, it had to come full circle on that.
He came full circle.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing thing. All right. Total Commitment is the name of the book. It's a memoir of God and politics when Republicans elected a governor in South Carolina. Many, many facets of that weave into what's going on today as well.
It's many of the dynamics in national politics today are reflected in 1974.
Pleasure, always is to have an
Thank
opportunity
you.
to talk with
It's
you.
good to be
Very
back.
much. Appreciate you being with us. Once again, Total Commitment by Dr. Hal Poe, a memoir of God and politics when Republicans elected a governor in South Carolina. And here we come full circle. It's an amazing thing. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Poe, and stay with us here at EPlusTV 6 because this is the place where the dialogue continues.